Today's August 6th in the year 2013. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television, and it is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Rona Barrett here at the Television Academy headquarters in North Hollywood, California. So that's how we start. So now we're really going to get into it. We're going to start right from the beginning. What was your name at birth?
Rona Burston.
Did you have a middle name?
Had no middle name, but I created a middle name for myself later on.
What was it?
Well, I started writing the word like Brenda Starr. I wrote Rona Starr Barrett, or Rona Starr Bursting, or Rona Starr, cut out the last name. And then eventually I said, nope, none of this works. And eventually I, one day, was going Barnett, Barrett, Barrett, Barnett, Barnard, Bennett. No. Rona Barrett. That was my name.
What appealed to you about it?
It just felt right. I always said to my mother that the nicest thing she ever did for me, really, was to give me the name Rona. Because when I was born, according to that book called, I think it was What's in a Name, there were perhaps 8 Ronas throughout the United States, and just was a very unusual name. So I always had this feeling that one day I was going to make something of myself, even from the time I was just a little girl.
Do you know why your mother selected that name?
Yes, I do know why my mother gave me that name. She told me that she was walking down a street with my aunt, and they came across a shop that was called Rona's Exclusive Millinery. And my mother said, gee, that's an interesting name. If I don't have a boy, maybe I'll call her Rona. If I have a boy, maybe it'll be Ronald or Robert. And I turned out to be a female, and so I got named Rona.
And when did you start to think about Starr and then Barrett? How old were you?
I think I started writing that when I was maybe 7 years old. But at 5 years old, I really knew, due to an incident which I have discussed many a time on TV and in my books, of a group of kids from school following me home one day after my mother had told the teacher, please don't make a fuss about what's happening to Rona today. She looks very different. I had been put in a big brace, and I had been born with, I guess you would call a congenital disease, except no doctor had a name for it. And so my parents couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, but I would drag a leg trying to get up in my crib, and if a big wind came along, I'd fall down and I couldn't get up. Somebody had to lift me. If I was trying to walk, step off the sidewalk into the gutter, I couldn't get back on the sidewalk. And I just couldn't walk up one step in my entire life, and still can't today.
Did they ever diagnose it for what it is?
Yes, I was a guinea pig for a number of years with a number of different doctors, and one in particular, Dr. Millerat at New York Medical University, Cornell Medical University, one of those names. And I was a guinea pig. And I was one of several people, I don't remember how many in the group, who were being tested for various neurological diseases. And they were convinced it was neurological, but they didn't know whether it was genetic or acquired. And one day, after about 10 or 11 months after being poked and prodded and given pills and needles and all kinds of different tests, the doctor told my mother that I had what he thought was an arrested case of muscular dystrophy. And he said, I don't know whether it's going to progress or whether she's going to stay arrested. If it progresses, there is a very good chance that she may not live beyond the age of 12, 13. And when I heard that news, more or less, I said, no, 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 famous people don't die young. And I knew around that time that for sure I was going to make something of my life, or I wasn't going to live. And so I was determined, what I didn't know at the time. But at 5, this first started, as I was telling you before, it started with a group of kids seeing me in this brace, and I looked very heavy, and I walked as if I was almost like Humpty Dumpty, if he could walk, had legs, like Charlie Chaplin, like a duck, waddled. And a whole bunch of kids followed me home from school one day, and I only lived a block away from the public school where I went. And they surrounded me like the wagons that were used as the Indians surrounded the wagons. And one of the boys there had a stick, a twig, a long twig that he picked up from a tree, and he started poking me, and I had glued myself to the tree, not realizing that the superintendent of our building, he was such a meticulous person that if somebody tried to carve their initials in a tree next to our building, he would always go out and tar it. Well, that day I didn't realize he had done that. And so when I grabbed hold of this tree, I found myself glued to the tar. And I tried to pull myself off, and trying to pull myself off, I fell on the floor. And the more I couldn't get up, the kids were laughing and they were howling and having fun. And a little neighbor friend came along and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And they picked me up. And she dragged me literally into the lobby of our apartment building, and everybody started to still laugh because it was just an uncomfortable scene, and I wasn't allowed to take the elevator to our apartment floor, which was on the 3rd floor or the 2nd floor, I don't remember exactly, and I said, I'll walk up the stairs. I do not know why my mother to this day never picked me up at school. She always picked me up at noontime to take me home for lunch. But that day, she didn't come. And I was not allowed to cross the road, but I decided I'm going to finally make it on my own. So when I was inside the building, all I could hear my mother saying, "Don't take that elevator, you're too young, I don't want to get caught in the elevator, don't do that." So I said, well, I'm going to try to get up these stairs. And I remember pulling myself up just one step, and I looked out the window, and I saw these kids' faces pressed against the glass door. And they were laughing at me. And I remember turning around to them and saying, "One day I'm going to be so famous, you're never going to be able to laugh at me again. Never, never, never." And that was it. At that moment, something came over me, and I said, one day I'm going to either be a famous lawyer who's going to take care of all those people who do not know how to take care of themselves, or I'm going to be a research doctor and find out what's really wrong with me. I'm going to be a medical scientist. And the third thing is, I don't know, I'm going to sing opera. But I don't know if I can do that, because if I tried, and if I ever succeeded, and I had a role that had me falling on the floor, how was I ever going to get up? And so in my mind, I crossed out opera singer or singer, and that was it. And then I started on the road, and things happen for a reason, and only now that you can look back do you know there must have been a reason, because one summer My parents were invited to visit some friends at a famous hotel in the Catskill Mountains called Grossinger's, and this young singer came on, and I remember poking my mother and saying, "Oh, Mom, isn't he cute? Isn't he cute?" And that was it. And I just developed this thing and came home from school one day, and we had one of the first TV sets on the block, and I turned on television, and it was the Dumont Television Network, and suddenly there was this band show there, and who should walk out on the stage, and I started screaming, "Mom, Mom, Mom, the boy from Grossinger's, he's on TV, he's on TV, oh my God, look at him, look at him." And to this day, again, I will never understand where I got the courage, but I was 12 years old at the time, and I went to my bedroom, picked up a phone, and I asked the operator for the phone number for the Dumont Television Network in New York City. And she gave me the number. I called, and I said, "Could you kindly tell me if that young singer, I think his name was Eddie Fisher, was on your program, and is he there now?" And she said, "Oh, no, he left the studio already." And I said, "Oh, do you know how I could find him?" And she says, "Well, I have the name of his manager." And I said, "Well, okay." And so she gave me the name of his manager, and it was the Blackstone Advertising Agency. And I then called the operator and said, "Do you have a telephone number in Manhattan for the Milton Blackstone Agency?" And she said, "Just a moment." And she came back and she gave me a number, and I said, "Is there an address there?" And she said, "Yes, it's 221 West 57th Street. I said, "Manhattan?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, thank you." So I called up that number, and it was nearly 5 o'clock. And this woman answers the phone. Obviously, what I later found out was the bank of phones. Stick the wire into the big board. And so I said, "Hello, I'm looking to find Eddie Fisher." And she said, "Well, you're just going to have to call back later because we're closing at 5 o'clock and it's 1 minute before 5 o'clock. So would you please call back?" I said, "Well, I may not be able to call again." She says, "Well, I'm sorry, dearie, but you're going to have to call back tomorrow." And she says, "Remember, we close at 5. So I said, "I got to find out, how do I get to New York City by myself?" I had never traveled on the L trains without my mother. My mother literally carried me up all those 4 flights of stairs to get me to the platform where the trains came. And I said, "I'm just never going to make it. Just never going to make it. I just don't know how to get up those stairs." And I said, "But I've got to." So one day I decided after school I'm going to tell my mother a lie and tell her I'm going to study with a girlfriend. And I found myself standing in front of the subway train. And I looked at those stairs, and I just said, "Come on, Rona, you can do it. You can do it." And I remember grabbing hold of the banister and pulling myself up one by one by one, and people were coming down the stairs and they would say, "What's the matter, little girl? Do you need some help?" And I said, No, I just hurt my leg and it's taking me a longer time to get up the stairs." Well, the trip from where I lived in Astoria, Long Island, was really only about 10 minutes by train to 57th Street. It took me over 2.5 hours, something like that, to reach 57th Street. And then I stared again at stairs and more stairs. And so I decided I would walk quietly to the other end of the platform where most people did not go up the stairs to get directly onto 57th Street. And the next thing I knew is I started grabbing hold of the banister again and dragging myself up, and suddenly I realized somebody was coming down the stairs, and two nuns in their full habits were coming down the stairs, and they were coming down in unison like this. And they said, "Is there something wrong? Can we help you?" And I said, No, don't worry. I'm fine. I just hurt my leg, and it's just taking me a longer time to walk up the stairs. I said, "Are you sure?" And so I waited for them to walk down a few more stairs, which they did, and I saw them as I turned. They were turning back to look at me, and I waited again, and then I started pulling, and finally, when I got to the top step of the second or third flight of stairs, and they were very big at the time, at least that's what I remember in my head, I looked around and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm free. I'm free. I made it without my mother to Manhattan." And I was like a half a block away from 57th Street, and I walked as fast as my little legs could carry me to 221. When I arrived at 221 West 57th Street, out of breath, I got in the elevator, went to the floor where they said was the Blackstone, where the Blackstone agency was headquartered, and I arrive and the door opens, and here is the operator to whom I had obviously spoken the day before, and she's now unplugging because I look at my watch and it is almost 5 o'clock, and she says, I said, "Oh, I'm the lady you spoke to, young lady you spoke to yesterday on the phone." She says, "I told you we closed at 5 o'clock. And she's looking me up and down, and she said, "How old are you? What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I wanted to talk to somebody about doing work for this young singer, Eddie Fisher, and I understand Mr. Blackstone handles him." And she says, "You do want to do what?" I said, "I'd like to do something for him. I'd like to help make him a big star." And she looked at me, she said, "Just a minute." And she got up from behind her desk and her telephone, I forgot what they called them at the time.
Switchboard.
Switchboard, exactly, thank you. Switchboard. And she left, and 2 minutes later she comes walking back with a man. And she introduces me to this man. His name is George Bennett. And she said, "This man does public relations here at the Blackstone Agency." And the man said, "What is your name?" I said, "My name is Rona Barrett."
Is that the first time you used it?
And he said, "Come into my office." And I said, "Oh my God, my mother's going to kill me. I'm going into a man's office. I don't even know who he is." And I told to the man the story that I have just relayed to you, and he said, "I can't believe that anybody as young as you would want to do something." And I said, "Oh yes, I do." And he said, "Guess what? I have an idea." He said, "How would you like to start an Eddie Fisher fan club?" He said, "We're looking to start an international Eddie Fisher's fan club, and maybe you'd like to help run it and create it." I said, "I don't know how to start a fan club, but I will learn." And I said, "By the way, do I get any money for this?" And he says, "Of course not, my dear. This is for free." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "What about your school?" And I said, "Well, I get out of school around 10 after 2, and I probably could be here somewhere after 3, not knowing how long it was going to ever take me to get up the stairs again, blah, blah, blah." And so began the beginning of my career I started Eddie Fisher fan clubs, started them all over the world, and the next thing I knew, I was working for another public relations company after school. I was the youngest person to ever be a record promoter. Then his records came off of RCA. I would wrap them underneath my arms. And for somebody who was more or less incapacitated in many ways, I would go from one radio station to another, and I'd walk, because I would never take a bus. I couldn't get up the stairs on the bus. So I would walk and walk and walk and walk and walk and walk, and I'd hand them to this one, and I'd hand them to that one, and I've got the latest Eddie Fisher record. You got to play it, you got to play it. And I don't know, one thing led into another, and one day I just realized that what I wanted to be was a columnist. I wanted to be like Dorothy Kilgallen. I loved the way she wrote her murder stories when she was covering some murder story. And Walter Winchell, because Walter Winchell was the most popular man in America at that time. You wouldn't miss Walter Winchell on whatever night he was on. I think it was Sunday nights. And there was, "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea, here for my first exclusive," and so forth and so on. And
actually, let's stop there, because I actually want to go back a little bit before we
Sure.
start there. Just a few housekeeping questions. When were you born?
I was born October the 8th. You want to know the year?
Yeah.
1936. I am 76 years old today. I'm not right now, anyway.
And I want to talk a little about your parents, their names, and what did they do?
They were Ida and Harry. My mother was a housewife, and my father worked for his father, who was in the grocery business. And my father was ambitious, and he wanted to have his own store. So he opened his own store, and that's how we got to move to Astoria, because his store was where a new project was going up for the union, for one of the unions, I don't remember which one. And he began his own business. And I was 3 years old at the time. And then I went to school.
What traits do you think you inherited from them?
I think I didn't know it, but I inherited from my mother the fact that she really was capable of being a risk taker. My father, on the other hand, I didn't know it at the time, but he was very negative. He was always afraid of something, and I think it was also because he was a small man. He was not large in stature, large in his business, but not large physically. And I think he had a real complex about that. So he was always frightened on some levels. But you know, when you're a child, you don't know what risk-taking really means. You don't know what being negative really is. You just assume, well, isn't this the way everybody lives? And so it wasn't until many, many years later that I realized that I probably, in many ways, took after my mother, but I was really much more like my father. And that played havoc with me. And it wasn't until many years later that I finally decided to figure out, why was I like this? And circumstances happened later on in my life that caused me to seek some psychological help. And it was at that moment that I had met a great doctor, and he said to me, the one thing I can't stand, if I can't fix you in 18 months or less, he says, I'm no good. And he says, and I know exactly what's wrong with you. He says, you're always thinking that little Rona can't do it, but you can do it. And you've proven that you can do it. And so he said, you've got to tell little Rona she must get lost. And I said, what do you mean get lost? You just have to look and say, every time you feel that you're getting one of those feelings, you just say, hey, Goodbye. I don't want you, little Rona. I want a new Rona. I want this new Rona. I don't want you. Don't give me that BS now. Just, and believe it or not, it worked.
Did you share your aspirations with your parents early on?
Oh, I talked about it a lot when my parents finally found out that I was going to New York City on my own. I thought both my mother and father would have heart attacks. And what are you doing, and who do you think you are? And one day, when I finally decided, he says, you've got to go to college, you've got to go to school, I don't care what, you just got to go. School, 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 school. But I, one day, just said, bye-bye. I said, I'm finished with all my education, and I'm going to Los Angeles, and I'm going to start my career there. I was already starting writing a column for the music business, which is where I really basically started. And I said, I'm just going to try my luck. And my father looked at me, you're going where? I said, I'm going to Hollywood. Hollywood. He says, who the hell do you think you are? I said, I'm Rona Barrett. What do you mean? He said, you're Rona Burstyn, that's it. And he says, you're nothing more than a grocer's daughter. And what makes you think that you're going to be anything more than that? So get rid of that nonsense in your head and just stay here. We'll find you a nice husband. You'll just get married and it'll be fine. I said, no. I said, I've saved up some money and I've got a ticket. And I've got the ticket, and I've called a taxi cab, and it's going to come and get me, and I've got a suitcase packed, and I'm going to Hollywood. And he said, no, you're not. We just screamed at each other, and he says, okay, send the taxi cab away. He says, I'm taking you to the airport. And I said, you're taking me to the airport? I said, you probably will take me some other place, but you're not going to take me to the airport. He said, I will take you to the airport. So he took me to the airport. I got on the plane. He said, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know where you got this courage to do what you're doing. He says, you're making the biggest mistake of your whole life. Just don't go. And with that, he kissed me and put something in my hand. And when I got on the plane, I opened it up, and he had crushed 3 $100 bills into my palm of my hand, and he said, you're probably going to need to find out how to drive a car. And he says, this is towards a down payment on it. And I arrived in Hollywood, and the day I arrived, I remember the plane landing, and I looked around, and I was just on the platform, walked downstairs, and I said, oh, thank you, God, I'm home. I never got lost once. The day I arrived in Hollywood, didn't know where I was going, didn't know anything, and that was it.
Had you always been interested in entertainment?
Well, I became very interested in entertainment through the work that I did with Eddie Fisher, and then with all the other artists that I met in the 50s.
What did you learn from that early experience about the business?
I learned that it wasn't an easy business, that what people, that old expression, never judge a book by its cover, was a very apropos remark. And I learned that everything people tell you is not always the truth.
Can you give an example of some of those lessons?
Well, I mean, it was, somebody said, oh, you were really very good at this, and I think you're really fabulous, and behind your back you'd hear somebody else say, I don't know what that dumb broad's doing, she's just a little kid, leave her alone, pay no attention to her, or things like that. But I was beginning to watch how deals were being made and what was really happening, and I was around in the public relations world where I saw how when they wanted to create something, they would, in those days we didn't use the word spin, but I sort of watched how they would more or less manipulate the press. In those days in Manhattan, there must have been 25, 30 columnists, and everybody had a job. You had to write for this person, and you had to write for this person. And it was always a one-liner, but give them a freebie. Give them something that you may have heard out on the street about somebody else or whatever. And so I watched, but it was only through things that had happened. And sometimes I think that we often make our own mistakes, and if we don't learn from them, we get into a lot of trouble. And I probably made some decisions that were just really terrible. And I would go home and cry my eyes out, and then wake up feeling good and start all over again. No one was going to stop me.
And this is still when you were doing publicity, or is this when you were already writing?
I was writing, and I was in Hollywood, and I was getting my first taste. I would hear things. I mean, somebody would say something to me. I wasn't on television yet. I was writing a newspaper column, and I was writing magazine articles. There was a story that happened many, many years later. A very famous star gave me a story, and I was just in my beginning days on television, and he thought that I was very unique and different, and he thought there was something that I was doing on television that nobody else had been doing. And so he said, I'm going to give you a big story. I can't remember what the story is right now, but he had a whole group of people at his home. And he said, oh, let's watch her, this Rona Barrett girl on television at the news. And so they were watching. And when I came up and I used that story, of course in those days lawyers have to check things out and so forth and so on. I mean, you just didn't make it up and then go on the air, as many people think that's what I did. But he then said, oh my God, how in the world did she get that story? Who would have given it to her? Why, it's not true. There's not an ounce of truth in that story. Nothing whatsoever. So forth and so on. And there were people at this dinner party, and one of them knew somebody I knew, and he said, you're never going to believe this, but you're friends with that new girl, Rona Barrett? Well, last night I was at so-and-so's house for dinner. We were all watching television, and she had a big story about this person, and he got up and said that she was a liar, that he didn't know where in the world I'd gotten this story from, blah, 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 so forth and so on. And the next time I saw this person, I said, gee, I'd like to ask you a question. Did you say in front of a group of people in your house that when I used the story about this situation, that I was a liar, that it wasn't the truth? And he said, yeah, I did do that, but I did it for you. And I said, why? What do you mean you did it for me? He said, I wanted people to realize that, of course, the next day or 2 days later, it ran in the trade papers, and I wanted them to know that you had a story before anybody else did, and that you were going to be important. And it was an interesting moment in my life and my career, and something that you don't really forget.
And did you believe him?
Yes, I did. Later on, I really did believe him, because he just became a big supporter of mine, and he was a major star.
Can you say who it was?
No.
Okay. When did you move to Los Angeles?
I moved to Los Angeles at the end of 1958.
What was it like at that time?
Oh, boy. It was the beginning of a real major transition. The studios were beginning to divest themselves of contract players. Television was just starting to come online, where it was having just not a big significance, but it was playing a part there. But the government had just decided that the studios should disentangle themselves from their distribution companies. And that was putting a big pressure on everyone, because the business was about to change. But the business was also about to change in many other ways, because what I started telling everybody was, we have a whole new generation of people who are who are in this country and who are wanting something different. It's like a major teenage revolution that we are having. There are more teens in this country than have ever existed in the history of the United States, and they are looking for their own idols, for their own expressions, for their own ideas, for everything to be different than that which we have been watching in the movies, and briefly a little bit of this and that on television. And there I was, and I felt like I was dying to meet all these legends of the movies, and at the same time, I was close in age to all of these baby boomers, and I felt that I needed to be the voice for them of what was really happening in the world of entertainment and culture and so forth and so on, and so I concentrated in that area, and as I was going to say, I felt like I was on the Mayflower, and the ship was sailing out to sea, and you had a choice to make. You was either a great ballerina, where you could do a wonderful plie or something like that, and one foot could remain on the Mayflower and one foot could go into the ocean, but you'd be splitting, and God knows where you were going to end up. And I decided I was going to put both feet into the ocean, because I couldn't do one of those ballet splits comfortably. And I stuck with the new and younger generation. And the interesting thing is when I eventually went on television, it took me 7.5 years to convince all the networks, let alone ABC, to give me an opportunity to bring to television news about the entertainment industry. There were, the entertainment industry was our number one exporting industry in this country. And I kept saying, when a person reads the newspaper, the first thing they look at is the headline. The second thing is, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, you either read the business section or the sports section. And the next one, if you were a woman, more than likely you went to lifestyles. And in lifestyles were all these different columnists talking about all these different people in all walks of life, but predominantly in the entertainment industry. And why was the entertainment industry so important? Because in other parts of the country, they looked at stars as being their royalty. We did not have a king. We did not have a queen. The president and the first lady never quite wore crowns, and therefore, while they were very popular and very important, they didn't have the same significance as somebody like Cary Grant, or somebody like Jimmy Stewart, or somebody like any one of those great movie stars from the 30s, 40s, 50s. It was a whole different era, but people adored movies. They escaped. It was great escapism for most people. And this country went through some trying times. In the 20s, there was the Depression, and in the 50s, we had gone to war in Korea, and we had just gotten out of World War II, and things just weren't the same. and I saw women as possibly the saviors. I know it sounds so ridiculous, but I thought that women could make a difference because I always felt that men never really gave birth to children. Women did, and so they knew more about what life, giving birth to life, was all about. And therefore wanting death and to watch wars and things of that nature was not really within our makeup. And I figured that the more that women could come in control and have a say-so in what was really happening in a world and how we viewed what was going on would be very important to report about. And so began the trial and error of how to do that.
Well, going even further back, though, when you first got to LA, how did you start to make a name for yourself?
I owe it to two men, two fellows that I met in New York City. One became a very big casting director, Marvin Page, and Marvin had moved out to California, and he was the one who kept nudging me to come to California. And the other person was a young man who was in public relations, who was just beginning to handle what I call young Hollywood. A lot of young actors and actresses named Jack Martin. He has since passed. And Jack, every time I would go, Jack would take me everywhere. And wherever he went, he would introduce me as, you better remember her name. She's going to be the next Walter Winchell in Hollywood. She's going to be the next Luella, Hedda, and then some. And that's how he was introduced me. So if somebody said, well, who's Rona Barrett? Well, I don't know, but somebody told me that she's really going to be somebody very important and powerful. Anyway, it didn't happen that quickly. So that's how it really started. It really started in a way with PR. Went back to PR. Somebody just keep telling you right out one after another. It's the old story, you know. Keep repeating something over and over again, and even if you haven't seen something or heard something, it suddenly registers in your mind, and somehow you find yourself in conversation using that expression or saying something about someone, whether it was true or not. And that was the hard thing, to start learning how to differentiate between who is telling you the truth, who is telling you what they think is the truth, and what is the truth. And is there such a thing as the truth? Or is it that from somebody's point of view, this is their truth, and they are then relaying it to you? And I think those were very hard lessons to learn about the world of journalism and what you tell people and what you don't tell people, and how you verify stories and how you go after stories. And the other part of it was, what I discovered is when you're having a one-on-one with someone, I think the first 15, 20 minutes of any interview you can throw away, even though somebody might be saying something very interesting, but they're telling you things that they think you want to hear. And then suddenly they say something, and it is from that one thing, because you are listening, that you then pick up the real story. And a lot of those kinds of things started to happen, and I realized that the story wasn't what I thought the story was going to be, but it turned out to be something else, where somebody was saying, you know, my father was an alcoholic. I don't know how we ever lived in this household. He was so abusive to my mother. And then many times, if they saw it in print, because I also was writing in print, they'd say, I never said that. I never said that. But on television, it was right there. And that's what I loved about TV. Yes, in the end, you learned how to edit things, but it was, once you said it, it was said. And you couldn't take back your words. And the art of interviewing was what I enjoyed the most.
Now, did you do a lot of that early on when you
Yes.
were
When I went to each studio and I asked the PR people, I'd like to interview Stuart Whitman at 20th Century Fox. I'd like to interview Mia Farrow. I'd like to interview this one or that one. Well, I don't think we can get you Mia Farrow, but we think we might be able to get you Tony so-and-so or whatever. And slowly but surely, you would have these conversations, and that's how people really got to know me. And then the stories were written, and people began seeing the point of view that I was taking. And my point of view really was to find out, was there a difference between the person that you saw up on the screen, which I called the REEL, and the REAL? And sometimes the two never matched. Sometimes some people were very good actors. But I often found that when an actor was nominated for an Oscar, that at least 90% of the time, the role for which they were being honored was a role that they understood so well because they experienced it in their own life. And therein lied always the story. How did that one element that you played so brilliantly on screen, how did you know how to do that? What made you cry? How did you get those tears out of you? And suddenly, people just blurted out. And it was terrific. It was terrific because in many ways you were showing the public, these people are special, but they're also just like we are. They get up in the morning, they go to the bathroom, they brush their teeth, at least we hope they do, they comb their hair, they wash their face, they get dressed, and they do everything that anybody else does. And yet we worship them in many ways because what we're really worshiping is not that person, but the role that they have so significantly portrayed up on the screen or in television. And finding that out, what made people tick, I think for me also was a way, psychologically, of finding out what made me tick.
Do you think that was a new approach? I mean, you mentioned Hedda Hopper and Llewellyn.
Oh yes, definitely, and therefore, after a while, I never thought of myself in those terms. I never thought I was another Llewellyn or another Hopper. For me, I brought something different, especially to a new world called television, and I brought stories about people. And it wasn't, oh, your next movie is so-and-so, and you play a priest. No one ever asked the next story, how do you know how to play a priest? Well, did you go sitting with a priest? Did you ever want to be a priest? I mean, I'll never forget that question that I asked Tom Cruise right at the height as he was crossing up from Risky Business. And I had done a lot of investigating, or trying to do at the time, and had found out that he had seriously thought about becoming a priest and had investigated this. And when I asked him that question, he said, oh my gosh, how did you know that? And I said, well, tell me why. And he couldn't really. And all I can say in the end I have a feeling that a piece of that interview, it runs on somewhere on YouTube. I think somebody has put it out there. But after that interview, he went to his press agent and he said, "I never want you to allow Rona Barrett to interview me again, ever." He said, "I don't want to be psychoanalyzed." And I felt like I was being psychoanalyzed or something like that. And I never interviewed Tom Cruise again.
Did that happen with others as well?
Not too many. Not too many. Most people really called me when there were very big stories, you know, burning of the flag, that I love him. He's a great actor. Forgot his name. Anyway, when there were big stories that could possibly hurt somebody's career, people would call me and say, "Would you want to do an interview with so-and-so and discuss what really happened?" And I said, "You bet." And so I had many more people calling me. Never PR people. It took me forever. PR people didn't trust me. They didn't. They just didn't want to help me. Television was something so new to them. They didn't have a piece of paper, a newspaper clipping that they could show their client, "Look what I got your name in this paper." And so eventually what I did was I took my broadcasts every day and I had them mimeographed and sent them to all the PR people and say, "Well, now you can show them that this was from my copy," etc. And that became a very big thing, and that's how it led me into writing the first newsletter about the entertainment industry called the Rona Barrett Hollywood Report.
Okay, you talked about how hard it was to get into television.
Yes.
But actually take us through that. First of all, why did you feel that you wanted to be on television with this?
Well, I felt that this was, again, a new age, and that television was the medium where people were going to go for their information. Without a doubt, there left no doubt in my mind that television was it, and that newspapers in the long run would be out of business or would not have the same impact as television would have. And I didn't think that I could keep competing with what was already in the newspaper, and I didn't want to. And I wanted to do something different, and I saw that this was a medium that I thought, not necessarily that I could do, but I wanted to do because I felt that the entertainment industry was such an important industry. It deserved a different kind of attention than people just thinking that you were talking about somebody sleeping with someone or whatever that was all about. And so every time I went, I saved up some money after I was writing a little story or something. I'd buy a ticket to go back to New York City and make an appointment to meet with the news director of every single network, CBS, NBC, and ABC at the time. And I remember having an appointment with the head of news at CBS, and he was that wonderful man, whose name also I have just erased from my mind. And on his floor was a copy of the New York Times. I'll never forget it. And he looked at me and he said, "Rona Barrett, you have a very good idea, but I haven't the slightest idea where I'm going to put you if I wanted to." He says, "You see, this is the first page of the New York Times, and you see the lines that I have on here? These 4 stories, I can barely get on the news at 6 o'clock in the 22 minutes that I have." He says, "I'm not saying that you should give up, but I can't do it at CBS." And then I went to NBC, and they pretty much told me the same thing. I went to KABC, which was the local Los Angeles station, and I started driving them crazy. "You have to give me a shot. You have to give me a shot. You have to give me a shot. Give me a shot." Well, I don't know. after 7.5 years, you have to realize this is not going to happen. But this is the best story that I can possibly tell you. Every Sunday, my mother and father called me. And my mother would say, Rona, darling, why don't you come home? Why do you need to bang your head against the door? You know, your bedroom's still waiting for you. Please come home. And I'd hear my father say, Ida, stop pestering her. Following Sunday, my father was on the phone. Rona, darling, why don't you come home? Why bother to hit your head against the door? Your bedroom's waiting for you. And my mother would say, Harry, stop bothering her. Stop doing this. So one Sunday when they called, I said, you know what, Dad? I've got something to tell you. I said, I've decided to give up. I've spent 7.5 years trying to make a living, trying to do the best I can and the best I could. And I just don't see any possibility that I'm ever going to go to television. And I don't see myself ever really making a fortune, ever writing newspaper column. So I'm coming home. He says, what? I said, I'm coming home. He said, you're doing what? I'm coming home. He says, no, you're not. And I said, what do you mean, no, I'm not? You've been begging me for all these years to come on home. Now you're saying no? He says, I swear to you, Rona, you must promise me. You must give it 24 more hours. Just 24 more hours. I said, Dad, it's Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. What am I supposed to be doing? It's a weekend. He says, I don't care. I just promise me you will not give up for 24 more hours. I said, okay, you win again. Okay, that's it. And I hang up the phone and I'm walking around my apartment and I say, that couldn't have been my father. All these years, both of them have been driving me crazy. Come home. Who do you think you're ever going to be? What are you going to be? They're telling me I'm really nobody. I'm nothing. I have no confidence now in myself and I want to go home. I said, Finally, I sat down at my desk and I took out a piece of paper and I started writing. Mr. Leonard Goldenson, Chairman, President, American Broadcasting Company, New York City, New York. I was going to send a night telegram, and this is what the night telegram said. Dear Mr. Goldenson, after 7.5 years of futzing around with me, either say yay or nay, you will try me on TV. Signed, Rona Barrett. And I call up Western Union and I send off this night letter. I go to sleep.
Did you know Leonard Goldenson? Had you ever met him?
I met him at various ABC functions when they had, the media was out to meet all for the new television season and so forth and so on. That was my extent of knowing him. And I'm awakened at 6 a.m. in the morning. And I said, hello? And this man on the other end said, hello? What have you done now? I said, who is this? He says, this is Elton Rule, president of KABC, general manager. He said, I just got awakened by Leonard Goldenson. And Leonard Goldenson said he had just received a night telegram from Rona Barrett. And he reads me this telegram, and he said to me, Elton, what do you think Rona meant by futzing around? And Elton said, Leonard, you can't use the F word in a telegram, and that's probably what it meant. He says, oh, well, Elton, this is Elton telling this story to me, and he says, Elton, I'll tell you what. You want to try her out at KABC, you have my permission, certainly, to do so. But I want to tell you just one thing. I've had Walter Winchell on the air for many years on our radio network, ABC Radio. And he says, if this woman is to have any importance or be good, you must let her be able to say what she wants to say about not only us, but everybody else. And he says, I don't want to hear from anyone that you didn't like a story she said, unless the story is so libelous or something like that, and the lawyers have still allowed her to go on the air. I don't want to hear from any of you. And I must say that I thought that that was the biggest and best remark that any future boss could ever say to anyone, because it set the tone right away. And so when Elton said...
Actually, that's amazing.